Welcome to the HMIS Barriers Fund training. My name is Lindsay LaGrange and I'm going to be leading the training today. All right. So first off, I just wanted to start off with a couple of housekeeping notes. If you're not already an HMIS user, this is not necessarily an introduction to HMIS. It's a little higher level than that. So if you will need to become an HMIS user, you will need to take the new user training, and a recording of this training will actually be a part of that. However, if you attend today's training, we can mark that down and you will not need to watch this part of the training over again. So again, please feel free to stay and learn today if you're not an HMIS user, but I did just want to clarify that this is kind of geared towards existing HMIS users. It looks like most of our attendees are, so that's great. One other housekeeping note: if you're sharing screens with coworkers, I see a number of people that that are doing that. Please type your name into the chat box. I know the housekeeping note on the last page said that you shouldn't do that, but for this small training, we can break that rule. And please just type your name into the chat box if you're sharing your screen so that we can know that you attended today. Okay. So our agenda today looks pretty short, but we're going to get into the nitty-gritty on some of these things. These are all things that are very specific to the Barriers Fund project. So we're going to be looking at, how to add service, which I'm sure most of you know how to do, but we're going to look at some details of that page that are going to be important to the Barriers Fund. We'll also look at reporting for the Barriers Fund, what types of reports, what to look at once you've downloaded them, all of that good stuff. And then finally, we're going to look at a new exciting feature that will be in HMIS soon: how to upload documents for clients and how to view documents that have been uploaded for clients. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box as we go, but we're also going to leave some time at the end of this training for questions. So I'm going to move into HMIS really quickly. Let's see. All right, so everyone should be able to see HMIS. Now I'm in the training site here, so this is fake data, and I bet all of my HMIS users are wondering why this looks so strange. Our training site was recently updated to ClientTrack version 19, which is why it looks a little different. We're going to be syncing these changes over to the live site in the next couple of weeks, and we will send out a bunch of notifications before that happens. There's going to be a very long 4-hour sync before that happens as well, so you'll definitely know it's coming. And I'll have a short video to send out to all of you about what these changes are. But for the purpose of this training, the main thing you need to know is that these changes are mostly aesthetic. So if you look around, everything is really in the exact same place, all the menu options. It just might take a few minutes to adjust to the new look. So I made this fake client for this training, and you'll see that my client has already been enrolled into this Barriers Fund project. I'm not going to walk through the Barriers Fund workflow in this training because the Barriers Fund project is technically a supportive services only project type, which has the shortest and simplest workflow of all of the project types in HMIS, which is probably a good thing to hear. So if you've trained and entered data for any other project type, whether that be a housing or shelter project like emergency shelter, transitional housing, or permanent supportive housing, or a non-shelter project like street outreach, rapid rehousing, or homelessness prevention, then you've seen all of the pages that are going to be in this Barriers Fund workflow. The one caveat I have is if anyone on this training has only trained for coordinated entry and only has access to that coordinated entry work group, you would need to do a short training to gain access to the correct work group in order to do this workflow. And if you think that might be the case, or if you're not sure, just email us at hmis@thn.org. I'm going to be repeating that email address a lot throughout this training, and we'll make sure that you have what you need to get started. So here's my client and their enrollment. Let's get started by looking at services. So as many of you know, we're going to click on Enrollment and Services to get to our Services menu page. you'll see that I've already created a few services for my client. This will come in handy when we look at reporting. But to add a new service, we're going to click Add a New Service. And I'm going to quickly just check my chat box to make sure everything's
Hey, Lindsay,
going well.
what did you
Okay,
say?
great. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So right now I'm in the shelter housing work group, but technically the work group that you need either the non-shelter work group or that shelter, sorry, I have a lot of work groups, y'all, or that shelter housing work group. As long as you have one of those two, you'll be good. The thing I was concerned about was people who only have access to coordinated entry. They would still need to do a little bit more training. Okay, so we're on this add a new service page. I'm going to backdate this date a little bit to match my enrollment date. And obviously we'll select our enrollment from the enrollment dropdown. Some of this might seem a little repetitive to those of you who make a lot of services, but bear with me. One thing I always like to remind people is if you try to choose a grant from this grant dropdown menu, things are going to go bad. So you'll see even if I choose the correct grant for this project, nothing's going to show up under those services. So you'll also notice that this grant field is not required. So we just ask that you just don't even choose a grant here. It's one of the few times we ask you to not give us more information in HMIS. So for this service, I'm going to choose some clothing. Okay, let's say diapers. All right, so the main thing I wanted to go over with y'all is this section, the units of measure, the units, and the unit value. So you'll see the automatic, the default is for count. So we would have one count of diapers, and there's a space here for me to put how much that would cost my agency. Now, THN does not necessarily look at this information. If you were to leave it blank, that wouldn't necessarily mess anything up on our end, but this section is really going to help your agency keep track of you know, what services you're providing to people, how much that costs, how many hours of labor went into that, whatever the situation may be. So the main thing that we ask with this section is just that you keep this consistent within your agency. For example, if you were to say that diapers were to cost $10 for one unit of those diapers, we would just ask that moving forward, you make that, anytime you were to make a diaper service for one unit, you would make it $10. And then you'll notice that there's a comment section down here too. So I'm going to press save when I'm done. And you'll see that now I have 4 services. We're going to look a little bit more at this once we get into the reporting section, but I just wanted to stop and see if there were any questions about how to add services. It's pretty straightforward, but yeah, let me know if you have any questions about that. Okay. In the meantime, let's move on to the reporting section and we'll look a little bit more at these services there. So if you remember, back in October of 2019, which feels like years ago, I guess it was years ago at this point, the HMIS reports all moved over to their own workspace within HMIS. So they're not in the home workspace anymore. So to run a report, we're going to click on the carousel workspace and we'll transition over to the reports workspace. Okay. So to run a report for this project, we're going to head to service reports. And the one that we're looking for here is this service by provider report. There's a lot of reports here, so if you get lost, just let us know. Again, email us at hmis@thn.org and we can point you in the right direction. But this service by provider report is the one that we're going to look at today. So all of our reports kind of look the same on the screen. Let me check my questions box really quick. What do you do for unit value about something like medical costs or prescriptions? Whoops, sorry, Kelly, I should have checked this before moving on. That's a really good question. So what do you do about things that where the price may vary? I think, I'm actually going to move back really quickly. Sorry, y'all. So I'm going to move back to my client's workspace so I can answer this question. So what do you do about things where the price may vary? I think that's a really good point, or I'm sorry, a really good question. I want to make sure I tell you the right thing. I might actually follow up with you about this later, Kelly. My go-to gut reaction is to say that, um, you know what? I don't know the answer to that question, and I'm going to follow up with you about it. All right, so let's move back to the reports. Okay, so I'm in my service by provider report. So all of these report pages are going to look very similar. At the top, you're going to see your date fields. I'm going to just say this year. Since we're in the training site, there's not a lot of data for my fake Barriers Fund project, so I'm just going to select the whole year to get as much of it as we can. Your organization will automatically be selected. And then we're going to have to filter by program. You'll see that there's a lot of options here to filter. You can filter by provider. We don't necessarily want to do that for this specific, this specific report. I'm going to choose my project from this drop-down menu, and you'll see THN has a ton of projects in the training site, but only your agency's projects will show up here. You have the option to filter by grant, service, users. We don't necessarily want to do any of that here, but you'll see you have the ability to filter by, specific users at your agency, like who entered that specific client. So you can really get as detailed as you need to here. Filter by age, but we're going to skip all of this because I want to collect as much data about my project as possible. So I'm going to press this report button down at the bottom, and a little pop-up menu is going to pop up. Now, like I said, I don't have a lot of data in this project. I've actually only enrolled one client, it looks like, but I figured this would help us kind of break down the data a little bit. So within this pop-up menu, there's not a lot of information here, but you can click any little plus icons like this, and it'll open up a little bit more. So you can kind of see a little bit more about what's going on. But you'll notice that my client's information is not here. I really don't know what I'm looking at. So we always want to select this little floppy disk. If you recognize, if you remember what those are, this little floppy disk icon at the top, click this little drop-down menu, and you'll see that there's an option for Excel. However, if we click this, it's going to give us a very limited view of the data. We always want to select Excel data. So let's click on that. It's going to begin downloading a file. I'm going to click on it so that it opens once it's done downloading. And again, there's not a lot here, but we can kind of just see what this report would look like. So you'll see that we have our client's name here, the service date. So this is basically a list of all of my client's services. This is a list of the service that was created, the units, all kinds of good information here. The main thing I wanted to stress is that you'll see that this is just one client, but there's actually 4 rows here. So this report is not pulling necessarily on the client level, but on the service level. So you'll have multiple rows for the same client depending on how many services they have. Another thing that we wanted to make sure y'all were aware of is this report, we're getting into the nitty-gritty of this a little bit, but this report is really made to look at referrals. So if you think about it, a referral is essentially a service that your agency isn't going to provide for the client, so you're referring them to someone else, right? So really, a service is kind of a referral to your own agency. So this unknown provider field, or I'm sorry, this provider name field where it says unknown, it's essentially trying to pull the provider field from that referral, which in a service that doesn't exist. So it's just going to say unknown, and that's because you've basically referred this person to your own agency. Let me know if there's any questions about that. The short version of this is just please don't pay attention to the provider name field or the provider ID field, because all these services were made to your agency. Okay, any questions about reporting? I'm going to get out of here. All right. Great. Well, let's keep moving along. I think the next section is the most exciting. Before we move on, if you think of any, oh, actually, there is one other point I wanted to make. Some of you may not have the ability to run reports. This is like a special permission that you need on the back end. So if you try to run reports and you find that you can't, again, email us at hmis@thn.org and we can make sure that we get you those permissions. Okay, and if you have any questions, let us know. Let's move along to the third and most exciting section. So I'm going to transition back to the client's workspace. Back on my client's dashboard. So as I said earlier, we have a big sync coming up when we're going to be upgrading to Client Track version 19. Along with these minor visual upgrades, we're also going to be upgrading how we store our data. So we're moving to a cloud-based storage system, which is very exciting. So the largest change that comes along with that is that we'll now have the ability to upload and save documents in HMIS. So let's dive into the details of how we would upload, what types of documents you can upload, and what file types are accepted. I'm actually going to switch my work group right now. This is not something that you will need to be doing. This is because these changes have not necessarily happened yet. So this is what things will look like eventually. Okay, so you'll notice that under the profile menu, once we have our big sync and everything is upgraded, there'll be this new option under the profile menu called document check. So I'm going to click on that. You won't see the document check icon yet until we sync. Once you get to this page, you'll see that it looks just like a lot of the other pages in HMIS, like the referrals page or the services page. There's going to be this add new document check button on the right. So we'll click that. So you'll see that we have 3 required fields at the top: document checklist, item requiring verification, and acceptable document. Depending on what you select from this document checklist menu option, you're going to see different options in these 2 fields. So it's going to take a little bit of time for you to get used to where certain document types are. For example, if we select homeless in document checklist, we're going to see options like Social Security, birth certificate, or driver's license. But if we were to select employer here, there's actually only proof of income. And then once we get down here, we will see we can choose pay stub or tax return. So you might need to kind of play around with this a little bit and see what options you have. So if we choose utility list, we have things like eviction related, lease related, utility bill related options. For this example, I am going to upload my client's pay stub. This 4th field is not required storage, and it kind of asks you in what condition is this document in HMIS. The I saw it field doesn't really necessarily make sense for HMIS, for uploading documents into HMIS. I'm going to choose this on file option. You have a comment box here if you'd like to add any more information. This verification date is sort of the date that you verified it in order to put it into HMIS. And then you have these 2 other date fields below. These are not required, but you're welcome to fill them in if you'd like to add more information about the document. So now it's time to upload our file. You'll click this Choose File button. And really quickly, I wanted to talk about what types of files you'll be able to upload. Basically, any still file or photo type file, whether that be a JPG, a PDF, a Word file, Excel files, any file that doesn't move. Unfortunately, video files are not going to be able to be uploaded into HMIS. The good news is, though, there are no size limitations on these files. So because we're moving to a cloud-based storage system, you should be able to upload any file size. So this is my file. I found it on my computer. I'm going to click open. And you'll notice that it kind of pops up down here. If I accidentally chose the wrong file, I can click this little X and delete it and then upload the correct one. One thing I really want to stress is that while it looks like my file has uploaded, it has not yet. If I don't click this save button in the bottom right, essentially this is going to disappear into the ether. So make sure you always click save before you navigate away from this page. And then one other little feature is this little camera icon. If the computer you're working on has a camera functionality, you can take a picture using your computer. Okay, so I'm going to click save. And it'll take us back to this document check history page, and you'll see that my document has uploaded. I've got my verification date and the document type there. So let's say you're trying to find a document for a client. Excuse me. Essentially, once this document check icon is in this profile menu, you could navigate here for any client and see any documents that they have had uploaded. And in order to download them, you'd click our trusty blue action button. You could edit the document check if you need to, or you could download the file. I'm going to click on my downloaded file, and you'll see that I just took a screenshot of the new HMIS login page for my document, but essentially you would see your client's document here. Okay, any questions about document uploading, viewing documents, anything like that?
Hey, Lindsay, this is Jim.
Hey,
I just wanted to
yeah,
pop in really quick, and we are in the process of updating that list of acceptable documents, so that when this goes live, you will see one for the Barriers Fund program that has larger buckets, so things like income eligibility, um, supporting documents. Um, uh, Proof of COVID-19 related need, things like that. So I just wanted to clarify that. The other thing that Kristen and I just recently talked about was how we were going to kind of connect the supporting documentation back to the um, the services that the subrecipients are offering to their participants, and so that verification date on the supporting document uploads should match the service date. And the reason for that is when we go back in to reconcile the services that y'all are providing and the support documents that support those services, that's going to create a kind of a one-for-one match, and it'll make it easier to to kind of go through on the back end. So I just wanted to update those two things, which are pretty new. And so I know that looking at that, there's a number of things on there that are absolutely not applicable to the Barriers Fund program. So don't get worried about trying to keep all that straight. There will be a list specifically for this project. Sorry to interrupt.
awesome. Thanks. No, no, please interrupt as much as possible. Okay, I think any other questions about any of this? All right, y'all. Well, I'm gonna stop sharing.
Hey, Lindsay, sorry, it's Jim again.
Yeah,
Would it be possible to like just do a walkthrough of like someone enrolled in the project, all like, and then I don't know if that's appropriate in this setting or not, but I'm just thinking like start to finish, what would someone need to do, or is that something that we can do like one-on-one with folks maybe later on once the program has gotten off the ground?
We can absolutely, you mean like walk through the workflow
Yeah,
essentially?
yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Let's do it.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. So I'm going to get out of this document check. I am going to change my work group. Again, this is not something you'll need to do. Things are just a little weird in the training site right now. Okay. Um, so my client already has an enrollment, but I'm actually, instead of creating a new enrollment for my client, I'm going to walk us through the enrollment that was already created. So I'm going to click Edit Project Entry Workflow. Again, for those of you who maybe don't remember, this is how you would review all of the pages that you filled out for a client. So the first page of any workflow is going to be this basic client information page. Now, obviously, everything is filled out for my client. Actually, one change that's going to happen with this upload, it's very small, but um, essentially now you have to fill in the date of birth quality. For example, this is not going to be automatically selected for you. So once you fill in your client's birth date, let's pick a random date, you're going to have to select if it's the full date of birth reported, approximate, all of that. Whereas before this would automatically happen for you. Again, it's minor and the system will give you a big error message if you forget to do it. So this isn't anything you need to stress about. So once you've filled out ethnicity, race, gender, veteran status, all of this good stuff, you'll click Finish. I'm going to press No Changes. And then the second page of the workflow is going to be this family members page, which you've all seen before if you've done an intake for a client. My client is not going to have a family member, but if they were, you'll basically just have to fill out all of this information into the row. And then the main field that you want to pay special attention to is this restriction status. I'm going to leave, well, I'm not going to have a family member, but if I were, I would leave this all on share intake globally. Unselect. Okay. Save and close to move on. And then we come to the HUD program enrollment page. So you'll see that my client was enrolled into the Barriers Fund project. This project name is going to look a little different since this fund, since this project will be organization specific. So you'll find the one for your specific organization. And then obviously once you select your client's row, this project start date will automatically fill in with today's date. So if you're doing any backdated data entry, you'll definitely want to backdate this field because this is going to be your enrollment date. All right. And then you'll also want to select any family members that you want to include in this enrollment who would pop up below here. I'm going to press No Changes. So now we come to that universal data assessment page. They're going to ask about the disabling condition of my client. This client location should automatically be selected for you, the Texas Balance of State COC. And then you're going to have these 5 questions about the client's prior living situation. Where they stayed last night is kind of what that first question is asking. The length of stay in that prior situation, the approximate date that this instance of homelessness started, and then regardless of where they stayed last night, the number of times the client has been on the street, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the last 3 years. And then the total number of months homeless on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven. One thing to note, we don't have any safe haven projects in the balance of state as of right now. So if you see anything safe haven related in HMIS, you can just disregard that. And then the last question on the UDA page, the Universal Data Assessment page, is this health insurance question, whether or not your client has health insurance, and if so, what type. I'm going to select No Changes. So the first assessment that we see is this the barriers page. I said that my client did not have a disabling condition, so you should see no here for all of the barrier present column. If your client does have a barrier, you could simply switch this to yes, and then it's going to ask you a couple of other questions about the barrier. Save and close. And then next we come to the domestic violence assessment. If you'll see that I selected no here for my client. If I were to have selected yes, there would be two questions that pop up, including when the experience occurred, and then if your client is currently fleeing. I'm going to leave this on no and select no changes. And now we're on the final page of the workflow. Like I said, this is really short and to the point. This is the income and non-cash benefits page. So I've selected no for both of these for my client. But again, if you were to select yes for income, there would be a section here for you to pick which type of income your client is receiving. And it asks for a monthly amount as well as a description. Excuse me. And then the same thing is true if I were to select yes for non-cash benefits. Below the income section, there would be another section for non-cash benefits where I could select which type, the description, and the monthly amount. But since I selected no, both of those little fields are going to disappear. I'm going to select no changes, and that's it. So just to reiterate, I'm sure many of you have heard me say this a million times, but anytime we start a workflow in HMIS, it's so important that we get to this page where we see that finish button. If we don't fill in any required fields, that's going to create a bunch of errors on the reports that we submit. So just make sure you always see this page anytime. If you have to step away and pause your workflow, that's okay. Just make sure you come back and fill this in. I see there might be a couple of questions. Can you walk through how you would enter a client in more than one program at a time? So unfortunately, that's a great question, Kelly. Unfortunately, we can't enroll clients into more than one programs at the same time. Let's say that we did just enroll our client into this Barriers Fund, but we also need to enroll them into our emergency shelter. Make sure I'm in the right work group. I would need to be in the shelter work group in order to enroll them into my client's shelter. Essentially, after I finished this short workflow, I would then need to press this intake button, right? This is how we start an intake for our client. It's going to ask me which client I want to use. This is the client that I need to enroll in my client's shelter, so I'm going to select use the current client. And now basically I've started a new workflow. I'm on that first page, that client information page for my client. I'm going to skip the first two pages of this to show you. So now we're on that family members page. I'm going to skip this too. We've already filled in all of our family members information. So now we're back on that program enrollment page. And this is where I would select my client's emergency shelter project. So now I would make sure I got my project start date right, and whether or not I'm backdating this data. And once I press save, on this page, an emergency shelter enrollment for my client has now begun. And then obviously there would be more assessments that we would need to fill out. There's a few more pages to the emergency shelter workflow than there are in the barriers one. But yeah, unfortunately we can't do two at the same time, simply because there are those different assessment pages that you'd have to fill out depending on your funding source. Does the barrier have to be approved by a doctor/disability? That's a great question. I'm not sure if Jim or Anya can help me
Yeah,
out with that
so I
one.
think on that field where the system is asking about disabling conditions, that is a HUD required data field, and specific to that question, it is based on client self-report. However, that for the Barriers Fund, there is no expectation, and I would just reiterate that there is literally zero expectation that the folks that y'all are serving must have an accompanying disability. So for some programs, and I just in the interest of like not muddying the waters, some programs you do have to document that. For the Barriers Fund, you still have to fill that section out, but it has no bearing on eligibility for the program. Does that help? Um, does that help, Corey? Cool. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim.
There's another question there.
So if yeah, so Kelly's asking, so if they're registered in shelter and provide a service through the Barriers Fund, would we consider it a referral to the Barriers Fund? Let me read that one more time. So, Jim, you might have to help me out with this one, but my understanding is if you're going to provide a service through the Barriers Fund, you would want to link it to that Barriers Fund enrollment.
Yeah.
Let me go to my
Yeah, no, that's
services
a
page. And feel free to jump in if I'm
no, no,
saying the
not at
wrong
all.
thing.
That's a great understanding. So I mean, I think in kind of like the abstract sense, if you're serving someone through shelter who needs the Barriers Fund, you would make a referral to the Barriers Fund. That doesn't necessarily need to be documented in HMIS or is something that we're suggesting that you do. So Lindsay's right. If you're providing a service using Barriers Program funds, those services need to be recorded under the Barriers Fund program enrollment. You'll still see that unknown on the reporting feature because that service is being provided in that kind of limited environment, even though that person came from shelter, if that makes sense. I don't think that there's a scenario in which in the reporting you're going to see anything other than unknown if you're doing it correctly. Is that kind of what you were talking
That's
about, Kelly?
helpful. Thanks, Jim.
What? No, Colin, definitely do not share logins for Client Track or HMIS.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big no-no. Unfortunately, because there's so much sensitive client data, there's a lot to know before you can log into HMIS using like data security, things like that. We have very specific requirements for all of our HMIS users. So if you do need access to HMIS, you will need to go through the training and you should email, I'm going to put our email address in here.
And I would just
You should email HMIS.
I was just going
Oh,
to add,
go
if
ahead, Jim.
cost is an issue for new user access, please reach out to Anya, and we will help you all navigate that.
Awesome. I wanted to loop back to Kelly's question for just a second. So just to clarify, Kelly, let's say you did enroll your client into your emergency shelter program as well. I'm not going to do that here for time's sake, but you would see all of your clients' enrollments here in this enrollment dropdown. So you would have the option to choose emergency shelter enrollment from this date or this Barriers Fund enrollment from 3/1. So to clarify for what Jim was saying, if you're making that service using the Barrier Fund funds, you would definitely want to make sure you choose your Barriers Fund enrollment here. So you're sort of linking this service to that specific enrollment, you're not necessarily doing it through the emergency shelter enrollment, if that makes sense.
Lindsay, I want to make sure Kelly caught that because I was getting some really bad distortion, so I want to make sure folks caught that.
Oh,
It might be me.
yeah, I can repeat that. Sorry. Um, so yeah, essentially any enrollments that you have for your client are going to appear in this drop-down menu. And actually, one caveat to that is only if this date field is within that enrollment period, right? So let's say my client exited an enrollment a year ago. This date field being what it is, it wouldn't show any old enrollments that have already been closed out. So we're only going to show enrollments that are specific to this date field, meaning if you have to backdate a service, you're going to have to backdate this date field before you would even be able to see that enrollment. But anyway, any enrollments will appear on this drop-down menu. And so essentially, if you're making a service through your Barrier Fund, You just want to make sure that you're attaching that service to the Barrier Fund enrollment. So if your client only has an emergency shelter enrollment, you're going to need to enroll your client into the Barriers Fund before you can make a service through that Barriers Fund. And I think that's all that we have for you today. Unless Jim or Anya want to jump in with anything. Yeah, otherwise, email us at hmis@thn.org with any questions. And thank you so much for joining us today.